Hello, everyone. Our today's guest is Max Moore. You can find his socials on the episode description. Max, thanks for joining, man.
Thanks for having me on, Salvador.
My pleasure. So, let's talk about transhumanism, cryonics, and future societies. So, first of all, I know that you're writing a book on biostasis. So, can you start by, what is your motivation to write this book, and what will the book approach?
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, just the idea of biostasis. It's usually known as cryonics, but it's not quite the same thing. Biostasis includes not just using very low temperatures to preserve the human body and the human brain, but also it could be possible chemical preservation. So biostasis sort of encompasses cryonics and other methods. So the basic idea is that for people who want to continue living and are not satisfied with 70, 80, 90 years and look forward to coming back into a future when we've solved the aging problem so you could live indefinitely in good health. The problem is that we don't know when that's going to happen. I think it's inevitable at some point, but it could be 5 years, it could be 20, it could be 100 years. We really don't know. And I've been watching the life extension space for over 4 decades, and in that time we have not managed to extend the human lifespan, the maximum lifespan at all. So I'm a little less optimistic than some people that we're going to solve this problem very soon. And given that I'm in my 60s, time is getting short. So to me, biostasis is a very sensible first thing to do. The basic idea is at the point of clinical death, which is not at all the same as biological death, we will treat the bodies to protect against the effects of cold. And to vastly oversimplify the process, we're going to then plunge you down to a very cold temperature, minus 320 Fahrenheit or minus 196 Celsius, having protected the body against ice formation, and then keep you in that state for as long as it takes, with decades, possibly even centuries, until we've reached the technological point where we can repair not only whatever it was that killed you in today's sense, the cancer or heart disease or aging itself, and then bring you back to carry on living. So it's kind of an ambitious idea. It's been around for quite a while and it is slowly catching on, but there isn't really a good recent book, in my view, that covers all the topics. So given that my background in this area, having been involved for over 40 years and having run the leading cryonics organization for around a decade, I decided it was really my job to write this book to address all the issues, the technical issues, the philosophical, the cultural, the psychological issues. It is a very complex topic that has a lot of implications. So I'm trying to address all of those in a way that's compelling and interesting to a wide audience.
Right. Okay. And you would keep your personality traits?
Yeah, it wouldn't be any good if your memories and personality were all wiped out. Then there's really not much point because you'd be basically kind of like a clone, which doesn't have any of your personality. It's not really a way of surviving. It's not really a better way of surviving than having children. So the idea is for this is that we protect the brain in such a way that all the memories are retained. I should say all long-term memories. Short-term memories will be lost as they are in general anesthesia, for instance, because those are electrochemical in nature. Basically, when you shut off the brain, short-term memories are lost. So that's like the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. But memories past that point are actually encoded in physical structures in the brain, changes in the synaptic connections and so on. And those can be preserved. We have now very good evidence, for instance, from the Brain Preservation Prize, that using good procedures under good conditions, we can actually preserve those fine neural structures. And so that means that we're not really gone. Our view is that what we call death today is kind of misleading. Just like people in the past called people dead who today we could revive because we have cardiopulmonary resuscitation, defibrillation, and so on. Today, when we call someone dead, what we're really saying is that we don't know how to revive them, or not even that. Sometimes you can revive them, but we say, well, what's the point? Because their body's just going to fail again. So we're going to call them dead at this point. And our point is that they're not really dead. If the brain structures are still there and potentially recoverable, what we need to do is stop them getting worse. That's why we want to put them in stasis or biostasis. Because in the future, obviously, just like today compared to the past, we'll have far more capabilities. So long as those structures are preserved and they're not changing at that very low temperature, there's nothing happening, there's no metabolism whatsoever. So you can wait as long as it takes, whether that's decades or centuries even, until we have the technology that may be able to repair them. So this is obviously not a guaranteed thing. Things can go wrong. You may not be found for a long time after legal death. You may have brain cancers, all kinds of things can go wrong. So there's no guarantee, and we can't be absolutely sure this technology will be developed, but I think it is very, very likely. So to me, the real issues are making sure the organization is going to survive long enough to bring you back and so on. It's not really the technical issue so much.
Okay, and like, what are the legal and policy considerations that must be addressed to accommodate the unique status of biostasis patients, particularly concerning like rights and identity and state management?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I devote quite a lot of discussion in my book to that. There's a number of aspects to that. One aspect is on this end of things, when you get cryopreserved, what are the legal conditions? Now, in most countries, there aren't really any laws about this. There's a few exceptions, like France is a little bit tricky. But for the most part, there aren't really many laws. The US is kind of an exception because of legal battles the Alcohol Foundation had back in the 80s and 90s. So we actually got a declaration in California that it was actually a legal option. You could do this. But generally, the law is pretty neutral. And in the US, that's good because in the US, at least in principle, anything that's not illegal is by default legal. That's not necessarily the case say, in Europe. But generally, it hasn't been a problem. The issue is that really, ideally, we don't want to wait till legal death to start this procedure, because by the time legal death is declared, you've gone through a lot of trauma with your body. It's basically falling apart before you're legally dead. So ideally, you would like to start the procedure before that, which we can do with animals. Ironically, animals, our cats and dogs, we can preserve them under better conditions because we can, start cannulating the blood vessels, we can anesthetize them, and we can begin the procedure before the heart stops, which is really much better. But you can't do that with humans because one of the things we'll do is to stop the heart. Basically, at some point, you've got to stop the heart, and that legally is considered homicide, even though the whole point, of course, is to actually extend the life. We're starting to get around that a little bit in recent years in a number of US states and, of course, a number of European countries with the death with dignity laws, which essentially mean you can schedule your biostasis, right? You can call up your biostasis organization and say, I want to go on next Wednesday or whatever date, and that gives the organization time to plan to send a team to your bedside, so that it's very predictable. Then you take your meds to terminate your life, at least from the usual point of view, and the team is right there, and there should be a delay of no more than seconds to a minute or so before they begin the procedure. So that really helps. That kind of legal change in recent years makes things easier to ensure really good quality cryopreservation. But also, as you mentioned, there's the issue of the legal status of patients. And we do call them patients because that's how we consider them. They have to be looked after. They're obviously helpless to maintain themselves. So they should have some kind of legal status, but right now they do not. In the eyes of the law, biostasis patients are considered basically tissue donations to the organization. That's kind of usually the way it works, which is, given that the organizations have very strict rules about how they treat them and their rights and so on, is not too much of an issue. But I think over time, once this procedure becomes more widely accepted, it seems inevitable at some point there will be a move to give cryonics patients, biostasis patients, some kind of legal status. Just like people in a long-term coma right now, you can't just go and, cut their finger off or, do whatever you want to them. They have certain basic rights. So I think that will be the case in the future. And then there are other legal issues as to if this works and you come back, do you have the same legal identity, or will you need to have a new identity? There's interesting questions that, with life insurance. If you have the same identity, do you have to pay back your life insurance? Do you have a right to, retirement benefits or property from the past? So there's a lot of interesting legal issues that arise if this actually works as well.
Okay. Yeah, and biostasis could significantly impact human longevity and evolution. In what ways do you think might the widespread use of biostasis influence our species trajectory, and how should we prepare for the societal transformations it may bring?
Well, I think biostasis itself won't have much of an effect on our trajectory. I think it's abolishing aging is what will do that. And biostasis is a way of allowing people in today's generation to take advantage of life extension in the future. But I think that the core change will be the end of the inevitability of death due to aging. And just to be clear about this, we're not talking about immortality here. People frequently use the word immortality, which really annoys me because that's not what we're talking about. If you abolish aging, you don't abolish death. You abolish death from aging. You can still get hit by a car, or have a plane crash, or die in a war, or a terrorist attack, or suicide, or homicide. There's lots of things can happen to you. If you look at the accident rates today, then probably if we abolished aging, you could expect to live on average for a few thousand years before something got you. Now, we may improve on that, just as we've improved on safety in the last few centuries, so we may be able to extend that further into the future. But this is not about abolishing death. It's about abolishing death due to aging and greatly extending the lifespan. And that, I think, will have massive effects on human culture. I mean, if you look at people like Ernest Becker on the denial of death, and all these writings about the trauma that death causes in our culture, it's very interesting to consider how will we think if we realize that death from aging is no longer inevitable and we have much longer ahead of us. Obviously, it's going to change a lot of things. It's going to change family structures. It's going to change jobs and retirement. It seems kind of ridiculous to retire permanently at 65. If you're healthy and vigorous indefinitely, you may want to take off 5 or 10 years, may want to retrain, do something else. So it obviously will have a great effect on how we organize our work and our family. It's interesting, political issues. Some people worry that some leaders will become, leaders forever, but I think there are obviously ways around that with term limits and so on. I think it'll have a lot of effects, and it's pretty hard to really foresee the details of those. Every time we try to figure out the details of the future, we usually get it wrong. So, in my last chapter of the book, I try to look at the future 100 years from now with a lot of caution that, it's going to be wrong in details. We can look at certain long-run trends, but if we try to figure the details of the future, we'll almost certainly be wrong. But obviously, life extension is going to have a pretty massive effect, whatever the specific details turn out to be.
Okay. And do you have an idea of how many people there are in biostasis right now?
Yeah, let's see. What's the current number? It's probably around 700 or so, something like that.
Okay.
It's getting a little harder to track. There are people who try to track that. So there's the Alcor Foundation that I've worked for have around, I think, 250 or something. If I check the website, Cryonics Institute have a little more. So they come to somewhere around 500. Then Tomorrow Biostasis, a fairly new, very vigorous organization in Europe, has a dozen or so already. Cryos in Russia, although that's a bit of a disaster, they have some number of dozens of patients, and various others scattered around. So something like around 700, I would say. And with people with arrangements for biostasis at some point, primarily cryonics, there must be probably around 5,000 or 6,000 people with those arrangements, which is really a tiny number at this point. It's ridiculous to me that it hasn't grown a lot more, which is one of the big issues. Why hasn't it? I think there are a number of reasons for that.
Right. Yeah. Now let's talk about cryonics. Can you first make a distinction between biostasis and cryonics?
Yeah, so as I said, biostasis is the broader concept. Biostasis, it kind of tells you what it is in the word, right? So it basically means putting your biology into stasis, stopping all biological or metabolic processes. So essentially, you're kind of in a solid state. Everything is locked down. There's no cellular metabolism. There's no deterioration. And so in that point, in that state, you can therefore stay for as long as it takes. It could be centuries. There's some damage going to be done by cosmic rays, occasionally dislodging a molecule and so on. So over thousands of years, that would add up. But, on a plausible timescale, nothing is changing. The cryonics, then, is one way of achieving biostasis. And to date, it's been by far the most popular one. But you can also do it through chemical preservation. For instance, there's a process called aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, which actually combines the two. So it involves cryopreservation, but also has a step where aldehyde is used to make cross-links between the molecules, which basically locks everything down, stops things from changing, slows down deterioration, or stops deterioration. So there's a lot of current discussion as to which is better, under what circumstances. Is cryopreservation, chemical preservation, this combination of the two. So I think it's a very interesting and productive time right now where we're looking into, what are the optimal ways of doing this and how can we do it better. So cryonics has been by far the most popular method. It was the one that kind of grew out of historical understanding. People started noticing that certain animals could hibernate through winter. Certain animals could tolerate a lot of ice forming in their bodies, and had some natural cryoprotectants, like frogs and various kinds of animals actually produce natural cryoprotectants based on glycerol, and it enables them to survive very cold temperatures. So people started thinking about, could we do this with humans? And even Benjamin Franklin famously speculated about that. He actually really thought more about the chemical preservation. He said, he was thinking, wouldn't it be great to see the future of America as a country that was just beginning in his time? And he thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could be put in a vat of Madeira wine and kind of chemically preserve with my friends to come back in the future? And of course, he realized that wasn't going to work today, but he'd done various experiments with, I think it was frogs he did. So he had a good idea of the principle, but he obviously knew it wasn't going to work with his technology. But out of that, we've developed low-temperature medicine. It's become quite routine now, for instance, in brain surgery, to lower the temperature of patients because it slows down metabolism. Basically, every 10 degrees Celsius drop in temperature halves metabolism. So if you go down by 30 degrees, that's 2 times 2 times 2. So basically, you're only deteriorating at 1/8 the rate, and that means you have more time to operate. So people in standard medicine understand this. And it's well known, obviously, now that we have millions of people walking around who were cryopreserved, but they were embryos at the time. So we know that we can cryopreserve humans, at least in embryo form. We also know we can cryopreserve human corneas, skin, heart valves, many other tissues. And obviously, eggs and sperm as well as fertilized eggs. So we know we can do that. So there's no absolute barrier to this. The difficulty today, in terms of demonstration, is we can't demonstrate the return of a human being from cryopreservation. That's just not possible with today's technology. But the great thing about the idea is we don't have to do it today, because once you're in a state of biostasis, you can wait, and it doesn't hurt you. So in the meantime, we've got to keep improving the technology. But we are keep pushing those limits. And in my long chapter on the science, I talk about the progress from very simple tissues to organs. We can now actually successfully and reproducibly cryopreserve mammalian organs, but that's still the cutting edge. One issue is to bring them back to function, you have to rewarm them, and it sounds odd, but actually as you rewarm them, you can get ice crystal formation. You can get crystallization, you can get recrystallization, where a lot of smaller pieces of ice form together into larger clumps, which can do damage. So you have to avoid that, and the way you do that is by warming very rapidly. And that, of course, is a challenge. The bigger the piece of tissue you're talking about, the harder it is to rewarm rapidly without doing damage. So if you've got a little tissue culture, that's easy enough, with an embryo, something like that. But going to like a whole mammalian kidney or liver, that's a lot more difficult. So there's a number of ways of doing that: radio frequency warming, nano warming, where basically you put magnetic nanoparticles throughout the system, and you can use that to warm more evenly. So there's a lot of research going into that. And this is not just important for biostasis and long-term life extension. It's also important actually to save lives today, because there are many, many people who need organs but can't get them. It's a shortage of organ donors. When you have one that's a tissue match, you have to maybe fly it a long distance to get there. Maybe you won't be in time. So what if you could cryopreserve organs, and put them in biostasis and keep them in the hospital bank, and then whenever it's needed, just pull one out and it's ready? That could save tens of thousands of lives a year just in the US alone. So there's a lot of research going on to improving these rewarming methods, for immediate benefit. But obviously it will also mean if you can rewarm organs, the brain is an organ, so that'll bring us a lot closer to demonstrating that this will one day be possible to bring people back.
Okay. And are we using animals to experiments?
Sorry, are we using animals to
Experiments?
Well, yeah. So obviously, with the mammalian organ experiment, there's a lot of rabbits and rats. There's been a lot of organ preservation work on there, and with some brain tissue. So those are the main animals right now. I think there's also some work on pigs to improve the perfusion process, which is the process of basically removing the blood from the body, because you don't want the blood, because it's basically water primarily, and that's going to crystallize. So you remove the blood as part of the process, and then replace it with a solution called a cryoprotectant. again, basically something derived from the animals that hibernate, using glycerol solutions and then adding DMSO, and now today much more sophisticated chemical combinations, where we're reducing the toxicity of the chemical while increasing its ability to prevent ice crystal formation. So that kind of work has been done in rats, mice, rabbits, and pigs as well. So yeah, you have to
And
do that. You can't just do a computational approach to that, unfortunately.
okay. And have we seen like animals waking up from biostasis?
Not from biostasis. Again, that's currently beyond our capabilities because the whole animal is a large system that we can't rewarm quickly enough. So we can't do that
Mm.
yet. But what we have done, and not a lot of people really understand this, it has been possible to take, for instance, dogs. This is actually done back in the 1980s. To take dogs, remove all their blood, replace it with a protective solution, and chill them down to just above freezing, like around 4 degrees Celsius, and hold them there for 4 or 5 hours with just external circulation, so that their body is not pumping their heart or anything. We're just doing external circulation, and then the fluid is removed, the blood replaced, and they're carefully rewarmed, and they've recovered and been perfectly intact. I've seen one of the dogs, in fact, back in the 1980s
Ooh.
after this procedure, and it was fine. No neurological deficits. So this has been done multiple times, and it's pretty advanced stuff. For instance, we had a visit to Alcoa, it's probably about 10 years ago, by Dr. Peter Rhee, it's Rhee, who's quite a well-known doctor. He was actually President Clinton's personal physician, apparently, and a kind of a combat medic. But he's also a low-temperature surgery researcher. And he, is not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon to use cooling in brain surgeries. It's usually just taking people down a few degrees. He was proposing taking people down all the way down to 10 degrees Celsius, which is pretty chilly.
Mm.
And the idea was to be able to treat gunshot wound victims who normally you couldn't operate on because they'd be bleeding out too fast. But by slowing everything down with the cold, you've got to extend that time. Well, Dr. Rhee came to visit Alcor, and we talked about the dog work, and he was amazed because that was more advanced than anything he was aware of, because unfortunately it wasn't published. So so that's still actually the state of the art. Nobody's managed to do better than that since.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, and how do you conceptualize the boundary between life and death in the context of cryonics, and what criteria should determine when cryopreservation is appropriate?
Yeah, so people in biostasis have a bit of a different understanding of death, and I actually wrote, my about a quarter of my doctoral dissertation back in the 1990s was on this topic. So, as I sort of hinted at earlier, historical definitions of death have really been at least incomplete, should we say, or largely incorrect. So for a long time, basically we said someone is dead when their heart stopped beating, when they stop breathing. But now we know that's something we call clinical death, which is not at all the same as biological death or true death. And of course, today, in many cases, we can reverse that. So someone can be clinically dead for quite long periods, in fact, and yet we can reverse that. And the amount of time people can be clinically dead and then revived has been getting longer and longer over time. So some people may have heard of some of the famous cases, such as the Swedish woman Anna Bagenholm, who was skiing out in, I guess it was in the Alps, and fell into freezing cold water and was not breathing for like an hour or more. It's not exactly clear exactly how long it was, but a long time. And she survived that because her body temperature dropped very rapidly, and she was taken to a hospital, and they had familiarity with dealing with this kind of problem, and they've gotten fairly good at it since then. And they were actually able to revive her with very little damage done, even though she'd been clinically dead for an hour or so. And that isn't even the record. There's actually an unnamed woman who actually was taken down even colder cold core temperature and revived. So, this seems like an impossible thing for humans, but it can happen if you drop the temperature rapidly enough. Most of the cases are actually in children because they have a larger surface area to volume ratio, so they can cool more quickly. So it tends to affect them more. So we know that lack of heartbeat and respiration is not real death, if by death we want to mean something irreversible. So what is it? Is it it's not lack of consciousness, because you can certainly be unconscious like under anesthesia and come back and your personality is retained. So in our view, what death is really, we use what we call the information theoretic criterion of death, which sounds very, very fancy, but really it just means that we recognize that our memories, our personality, everything that makes us who we are is encoded in physical structures in the brain. Right? It's primarily the brain that matters. The body is good for expressing it, but the brain is really where it matters. So if we can preserve those brain structures, even if they're quite damaged, so long as some potential technology could repair them, then you're not really gone. And, let's put it this way, it's actually quite hard to destroy the information in the brain. We know this actually from the era of cryptography, where people may think they've destroyed information, such as by shredding sensitive documents, but actually it's quite possible to reconstruct those now with modern techniques. So it's actually fairly hard to destroy structure. You have to really get into the brain and stir things around or leave it for a very long time. Structures actually persist a lot longer than people think. They have this mistaken idea that 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen, the brain dies. It's actually it's some truth to that, but it's really kind of incorrect. If you protect it in the right ways, you can greatly extend that. So when are you really dead? You're not truly gone until no possible technology could revive you, repair and revive you. So that obviously, if you're incinerated and there's just ashes left, there's no possible known technology within the laws of physics that could fix that. But it's hard to say how far is too far. You could have a pretty badly damaged brain. There could be ice crystal formation. There could be a lot of other problems. But so long as you can infer the structures that were there and repair them using some advanced molecular nanotechnology or whatever like that, then you're still potentially recoverable. So it's kind of a criterion that should stand indefinitely, because it's whether we can bring someone back will depend on the level of technology. But it's more of a sort of in principle definition. You're not truly gone until the structure that preserves your memories and personality has been really destroyed. And of course, that's not an all or nothing matter. That's a matter of degree. So it may be that you only 90% survive or 80% survive, depending on the quality of your preservation.
Okay, right. Okay, and what kind of strategies are in place to ensure that sustainability and security of cryonics facilities over extended periods?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I spent quite a lot of time discussing that in the book too. I wrote a 2-part article on that for Cryonics magazine a few years ago. So yeah, it might seem pretty daunting if the organization needs to survive for we don't know how long, a number of decades, maybe a century. I figure something like maybe around a century, but we really don't know. So if you look at commercial organizations, it looks a little depressing, because most commercial organizations don't last that long. Obviously small businesses tend to disappear pretty rapidly. Even large companies, there aren't that many that survive for 100 years or more. So when I looked into this, what I found was that the organizations that really last for centuries tend to be non-profit organizations. There's religious organizations like churches. Obviously the Vatican's been around for a long time, but also educational organizations, universities. I went to Oxford University, which is apparently the second oldest one in the world. It's been around for quite a few hundred years. So those tend to be able to last a long time. There are some exceptions. In Japan, interestingly, there are quite a few commercial organizations, usually family businesses, that have been around for a long time. I think the record was 1,400 and some years, until it was finally acquired in the, I think, late 20th century. So, it was acquired, so it still kind of exists in that sense. But generally, it seems like non-profit is the way to go, because you can really plan for the long term. So that's why most cryonics organizations, at least the storage part of them, the people who care for the patients, are non-profits. Now, in the case of Alcor, the whole organization's a non-profit. In other organizations, for instance, Tomorrow Biostasis, which I think is a really good organization, they have at least a nominally for-profit membership organization. But when you're actually cryopreserved, you're then transferred to the European Biostasis Foundation, which is a non-profit organization. And like Alcor, they have a patient care trust fund, where so basically when you pay for this procedure, after paying for the cost of the procedure, the rest of the money is put into a long-term fund, which is managed very carefully and cautiously, enough to stay ahead of inflation, but not to take a lot of risk. So that funding should then be maintained over the decades. And there are examples of trust like that have lasted very long periods of time. So the idea is that whether it's 50, 75, 100 years from now, once repair and revival becomes possible, you can then use those funds for that process. So that's one point. But there's a number of other issues as to how you manage the organization over that long period of time. So I have some discussion about what kind of board is the appropriate structure. Do you want a member-elected board? Do you want a self-perpetuating board? Some kind of combination. And there's a lot of issues like that. There's issues. I point out a number of questions you should ask any organization before you decide to join, in terms of how they manage their money. Do they keep a separate fund for patients? Because, for instance, Cryonics Institute, which has got actually more patients than anybody else, they do not have a separate patient care trust fund. And this is something, their advantage is they're a lot less expensive than Alcor and Tomorrow Biostasis, but the downside is they don't offer standby as part of the process. You have to do that extra. But the other big thing is they don't have a patient care trust fund. It's just all the money is sort of mingled together. And that disturbs me, because if they have problems, the membership growth slows down, the costs go up, they could run out of that money. Whereas at Alcor and Tomorrow Biostasis, that money is protected, it's legally separate, cannot be used for any purpose other than the patients. And I think that's something you really want in an organization that's going to care for you over that period of time.
Okay, and how much does it cost?
Well, that really depends on whose services you use and what you have. So on the low end of things, Cryonics Institute will preserve people for, what is their current rate now, around $30,000 or something. But that does not include, very importantly, what we call SST, standby, stabilization, and transport, which is really a critical thing. Because if you have a funeral director deliver your body to Cryonics Institute, there could be long delays. You're going to be in really bad shape. So you really want to have a team at your bedside, starting the process immediately after legal death or as soon as possible, transporting you effectively to the organization. So at CI, you have to make separate arrangements with an organization called Suspended Animation, which I think is like another $65,000. So it's going to be close to $100,000 anyway. At Alcor and Tomorrow Biostasis are fairly similar. At Alcor, if you want to preserve the brain only, well, actually the brain within the skull in their case, it's $80,000 to $100,000. Again, a chunk of it which goes into the patient care trust fund. For a whole body, it's I think starts around $220,000. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but I have to point out that most people pay for this with life insurance. They don't have that much cash sitting around. So especially if you're fairly young, it's not that expensive to have a life insurance policy. Some people start with the term policy, which I don't really recommend, but if you're starting off early in life and haven't built up your earnings yet, that's a reasonable way to start. But you really want to have a permanent policy like universal life or whole life policy, so that you will never run out of that money. So most people don't have much cash. They don't just pay for it. Some people can, but most of us pay with life insurance, which makes it a lot more affordable.
Okay, yeah, and I feel like the public perception of cryonics is often very skeptical or dismissive. What communication strategies do you recommend to foster a more informed and open-minded public discourse on the subject?
Yeah, I think people should be skeptical. I mean, obviously, this is something we can't prove is going to work yet, but as I said, there's plenty of evidence that we're moving in that direction. So people should be skeptical, but they shouldn't be dismissive. Anybody who says something's impossible generally are making an argument from lack of imagination. They can't imagine how it could work, so therefore it doesn't work. And I talk about that in the book too. And we see many historical examples where people look foolish in the long run. But they should be skeptical. They should ask questions, whether it's about the technology or about the organization itself, as we were just discussing. I think all we can do, and this is why I'm writing the book, is to educate people on all these topics. This is a very complex issue. It has these different aspects of legal, technological, social, psychological. I think that's the combination of those, and the uncertainty is what makes it unpopular. Uncertainty is not something humans like. We like dogmas, we like religions, we like our politics are definitely right and the other people are definitely wrong. We love certainty. And biostasis doesn't offer certainty. We're too honest. We don't say this is definitely going to work. We actually point out all the things that could go wrong. And that's not what most people want to hear, especially when dealing with death. They want a guaranteed answer. So it's kind of hard to deal with that. All you can do is just be honest about it and say, well, it's still worth trying. There's still a decent chance this will work. And then you can address the technical issues. Like I mentioned, the common belief that the brain dies after 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen, which is a vast oversimplification. So I address that. I have one of the frequently asked questions videos for Alcor I did, which is on YouTube, addresses that one specifically. So just addressing these misunderstandings, or the idea that dead is dead, that suddenly at some point you stop breathing, you're all gone, which is just clearly wrong and misunderstands how memory works and so on. So just trying to address things factually and understand why people have difficulties with the idea, and just address it gently. I've talked about it with people with religious beliefs, which I don't think should be an obstacle. People may think it is, but there's nothing in any holy book that says thou shalt not be cryopreserved. In fact, many of the religions say you should not die sooner than you have to. Your life is a gift from God, and you should preserve it. So actually, it should be more pro biostasis. So really, just addressing people's misconceptions, correcting them, firmly but calmly, explaining how it works, showing the progress that we're making, putting that all into the context of medical progress over the years, and I think people can start to see actually it's quite a reasonable idea and plausible, whether or not in the end you think it's going to work.
Right. Yeah, but why do you think this is, still a very unknown concept?
Yeah, it's interesting because the idea's been around since the 1960s. I mean, a little earlier in fiction, but since the 1960s, since Robert Edinger published his book in 1964. And it's got a lot of publicity. I mean, I've done hundreds of interviews on the topic, and other people have done many too. So there's a lot out there, and yet it's amazing how many people have either not heard of it at all, or just vaguely have some vague idea because they've seen it in a science fiction movie. Right? We see it fairly often in science fiction movies, but people think, well, it's just a fictional thing. So it's amazing to me that more people aren't already familiar with the idea and know more in detail. I don't know why that is. I think people don't really want to think about it because it's basically requires you to think about your own death, which is not much fun. You have to really seriously confront that and recognize, stop being in denial, recognize, yes, that's going to happen one day. I better do something about it. And then you have to go through some work. You have to finance it. You have to do the paperwork, sign the contracts. You may have family members who dislike the idea, going to give you a hard time, which actually is a very powerful factor for many people. I've seen people come to sign up and then the spouse has said, no way, I'm going to divorce you. It can be very brutal, and then they don't do it. So there's a lot of kind of social disapproval, people thinking it's weird, people feeling embarrassed about doing something strange. So that's something that obviously we can overcome over time. There's going to be some kind of critical point where it becomes familiar, or enough well-known people are doing this that it's taken seriously. So when that point will be, I don't know. We just got to keep pushing, and eventually we'll reach that point. I think with the improvements in scientific progress and demonstrations, if we could actually, and this is still quite a way off, I think, if we could actually reversibly cryopreserve a mouse, for instance, or a rat, I think that would be pretty impressive and show that its brain was still fine. That's not going to happen anytime very soon. That's a difficult problem. But the accumulation of evidence, just addressing the arguments and addressing the misconceptions, having some public people, like, it'd be nice if Stephen Hawking had been cryopreserved. I'm kind of disappointed that he wasn't. That would have probably given it a lot of credibility. So just bit by bit, we have to just keep pushing on this until eventually people will go, oh yeah, it is kind of insane that as soon as someone's body fails, we just destroy them. We just incinerate them in an oven, or we bury them in the ground to be eaten by worms and bacteria. I guess that is pretty crazy when we could actually be preserving them and giving them a chance at least of coming back in the future. So I sort of take a position, looking back from the future on the present. They'll think, what the hell was wrong with those people? They were just taking their loved ones and allowing them to be completely destroyed when they could have given them a chance. It'll seem crazy, just like some past practices seem nuts to us today. So one day this won't seem strange or the exception. It will be the norm.
Right. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about the future societies and human enhancements. What do you think are the ethical boundaries should guide the development and implementation of enhancement technologies like biostasis to ensure they contribute to positively well-being without exacerbating social inequalities?
Well, first of all, as we get into this discussion, let me just make something clear. You don't have to be a transhumanist to be involved with biostasis. I mean, to me, it just makes sense. If we're going to have that kind of technological progress, we're going to have these opportunities in the future to enhance ourselves in various ways. But, you could not necessarily want any of those or expect any of those to happen and still want to continue living, right? So just want to make that clear. You don't have to be a transhumanist or have those kind of views to be in favor of biostasis. But again, it just makes sense to me that, to put the two together, because I want to get into the future where we will have these capabilities. I personally would like to improve my intelligence, my ability to reason, improve my memory. I like to improve my emotional processing. Our brains are not really very sophisticated to deal with the complex issues we deal with. I mean, our brains basically haven't changed in tens of thousands of years before we really had civilization. So it's amazing they function as well as they do, dealing with these very complex problems. So, intellectually, emotionally, I think we could be vastly improved. Obviously, physically, we could make various improvements that would make it very hard for us to die. If you have nanotechnology, you could reinforce your bones, including your skull, with diamond fiber, so it's very hard to do damage. Obviously, enhance the immune system, that kind of thing. In terms of policies, I personally am very hands-off. I think it's very dangerous to give governments the power to decide what you can and cannot do. So there may be some rare exceptions to that. For instance, if someone engineered a change in the brain that would make you dangerously insane, then I think that's kind of a fairly obvious case where you wouldn't allow that because it's just making things worse. But in general, I think the best policy is hands-off by the government, and I suggest a principle of what I call morphological freedom. Basically, the individual has a fundamental right to decide for themselves, with informed consent, whether or not to adopt any kinds of enhancements or augmentations. It's just too dangerous to let central authorities do that. I mean, they're going to probably choose for obedience, right, and things like that, and to maintain their power. So I'm very wary of having any kind of government control of that kind of thing, other than the very obvious cases where you're doing damage or limiting someone's capabilities. You don't want to produce a crippled child or intellectually disabled child. But any kind of true augmentation, I think those should be legal, and we should keep government out of the way. We have a history of governments dealing with this stuff, and it's not pretty. So people, when they talk about eugenics, confusing these two things. They're confusing eugenics itself, which is perfectly reasonable. It means just good genes, right? There's nothing wrong with good health. The problem has been central control. It's been even the U.S. government sterilized groups of people. In China, there was sterilization. There's some pretty awful abuses. But that was not eugenics, that was the central control. So that's really why I think it should be up to the individual, given standards of informed consent.
Okay. Yeah, you've also often spoken about precautionary principles, emphasizing calculated risk over fear-driven restraints.
Mm-hmm.
How do we apply this kind of mindset at a collective level when it comes to global risks like climate change, where precaution dominates political discourse?
Yeah, so your listeners may be familiar with the precautionary principle. It's become pretty well known. It's pretty much embodied in the European Union's legal approach. It also really explains a lot of US regulation as well, like for instance, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is currently a big issue for me because I'm been a fan of nuclear power for a long time, and it looks like it's finally maybe starting to come back. But the regulatory agency in the USA, the NRC, has been very hostile to nuclear power. It's made it pretty much impossible to build anything, and it's raised the costs enormously, and that's true actually in most countries. And it's been based on the precautionary principle that basically no risk is acceptable, which is ridiculous because by not doing something, you also have a risk, right? For instance, fossil fuel power plants, which have allowed us to produce modern technological civilization. So let's not come down too hard on fossil fuels. Without them, we wouldn't be here. But the fact is, they do pollute, they do cause deaths. Fewer, thanks to better scrubbing technologies. But compared to nuclear power, they do cause a lot more deaths. So it's kind of ridiculous to have a zero risk approach to nuclear power when it's the alternative is something worse. And a real example of this is in Germany, where they shut down the last nuclear power plant, and now they've been having to replace energy with coal, for goodness sake, which is just crazy. So by being too cautious, you can actually have the problem that you make things worse because you haven't considered the alternatives. So the precautionary principle basically is something I developed that says, don't just look at the downsides of something, look at the positives and the negatives, and do it in an objective way. So a lot of these risks are sort of made-up risks or exaggerated risks. They're not really based on true evidence. So part of my principle is that you use the best available methods for assessing the risks, but then balancing them and looking at the positives. So, people will talk about artificial intelligence essentially enslaving or destroying humanity. Well, it could also save our lives by accelerating progress in medical research. So you've got to sort of weigh both sides of that. In
Yeah.
terms of the global warming stuff, um, this is a classic example because people become so focused on what they see as the threat. And it's just the latest in a long line of these threats, right? We've had so many over the years that actually haven't really, overpopulation and the ozone layer and on and on. There's so many of them which haven't turned out to be a real problem. So I think there's a lot of exaggeration, and so people tend to overreact. They want to, like Germany did, shut down reliable energy systems without really thinking of the danger that's going to lead into. And we're now seeing, in Spain and Portugal recently, and the risk of this in various parts of the US, with a large penetration of solar and wind, which are just unreliable at various times. The base load gets too low. You don't have enough momentum because you don't have the big turbines going. It could lead to outages, affecting very large numbers of people. And I think we're going to see more of this unless people wise up. So by by pushing too hard on certain fears, you may actually end up making things a lot worse. And I think that's certainly the case with the global warming issue, where if you take the most official body, the IPCC, what it says doesn't at all sound like what you see in the newspapers. It doesn't at all. They do see certain risks and downsides in the long term, but nothing like what you see in with the headlines. And that's even though the
Max.
IPCC itself is inherently biased because it was set up to show that it was a problem
Max.
and how to deal with it, and also because they're using this model called RCP 8.5, which basically is completely unrealistic. It assumes that we'll pretty much give up most of our energy sources and switch to coal,
Max, are
which is the opposite of what's happening, right? So it also assumes a much higher population than looks plausible. So it's producing much more extreme results. But even with those very unrealistically extreme
Max?
results, the IPCC still doesn't see a huge amount of problem. There are not much worse storms. It's not worse flooding. I mean, it's all very gradual. Sea level rise is very, very gradual. So the downsides are actually not as large as I think most people see. Plus, when do you
Max?
ever see the positives reported? You almost never see the positives, but they're very real. We can already see quite a considerable increase in plant productivity. There's certain plants benefit more than others from more carbon dioxide, but it's definitely increased productivity, which means you need to use less land and people get plenty of food. Colder places see fewer deaths. One thing people don't realize, and you can look at the Lancet study on this, which is quite representative, far more people, at least 10 times more people die from cold than from heat. So it may be true that if the world is warming, you'll get some more heat deaths, but actually you'll save a lot more people from fewer cold deaths. Also, most of the heat actually is not in the hot part of the day. It's actually warmer nights and warmer up in the Arctic area. So the warming effect isn't really having so much of a bad effect, and the less cold is actually quite positive. But you don't really see the results of that. Even Ted Nordhaus, who I have a lot of respect for, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who did a study of the costs of global warming, and he figured out that by the end of the century, it might cost us like 3% of GDP, which is really not very much compared to what we would have had. But he didn't account for any of the positive effects, and this is kind of typical. So this is where I think we should be very cautious about being cautious about the precautionary principle. Try to look at things objectively, not just what the popular media says, and be very careful at taking drastic actions that could harm energy systems on which we all depend. Also, be very careful about stopping developing countries from using efficient energy sources. If you make them use solar and wind exclusively, they're going to remain poor and very vulnerable. Having plenty of energy available is the best way to deal with any real issues from
Max?
global warming or climate change. We can build dams, we can raise things from the sea level. People in like the Netherlands are used to living basically below sea level and dealing with that. We can have air conditioning and so on. So, I mean, most of Europe doesn't have air conditioning right now, so that's one thing that you could do. When Europe has a heat wave, it's kind of funny. I live in Arizona, right, where the temperature is almost always higher than what they call a heat wave, and we don't see it as a big deal at all because we have air conditioning. So long as we have reliable and plentiful energy, we can deal with these issues. We really have to look at the positives and the negatives in an objective way, which I don't think has been done very well.
So why do you personally want to be in biostasis or in a state of biostasis rather than just extend your life?
Well, I think life is way too short. It's not always easy. It's not always fun. It's some very difficult times. But overall, I think being alive beats not being alive and being non-existent. So first of all, I don't believe in an afterlife, any kind of supernatural afterlife. I ceased believing in that when I was maybe 14 or so. So there isn't anywhere else to go as far as I'm concerned. And even if there were an afterlife, how do we know what it's like? That's one question I sometimes ask my philosophy of religion students, because
Mm.
nobody seems to actually think about that question. They just assume an afterlife will be a wonderful place. But what if it's not? Maybe it's a pretty awful place, even if you don't go to hell. So we just kind of assume, and people don't have a very clear idea of what that is. Anyway, so I don't believe in that stuff. So the alternative is, do I just accept death when it comes along? Just accept aging and death? Well, no. Why should we do that? I mean, we've already pushed back the age of death quite a lot. Several decades compared to a century or two ago on average. So why not go further with that? My view is we're really just getting warmed up in life by the time we start to decline. So ironically, we're increasing, well, hopefully increasing in intelligence and knowledge and wisdom as time goes on. Not everybody manages that, but that's what should happen. But at the same time, we're also declining in terms of vigor, both physical and cognitive, which is a pretty tragic thing, really, that one thing is improving while the other is going down, so you can't really enjoy the benefits of that greater wisdom. So what if we could maintain our vigor and vitality indefinitely while continuing to hopefully improve ourselves and get smarter and better people? I think we could end up actually as vastly better people. It takes time to work on yourself, to improve yourself, and we'll have more time to improve the world, to contribute to the world, and to enjoy it. So I think those are all good things, and just kind of lazily saying, well, I'll just accept it. My time has come. Well, there is no such thing as the time. It's not foreordained by anybody. If we can fight it
Yeah.
back through research and anti-aging, then why not do that? Why not make the most of life? Life is what all the goodness comes from.
Right. And what about your family? Like, do they also want to be in biostasis? Your wife?
Yeah, well, I should say nobody wants to be in biostasis. That's not the plan. It's really the way I like to think of it is it's kind of like with financial planning. If you go to a financial planner and you're trying to decide what to do with your
Mm.
money, they'll say the first thing you should do is to create an emergency fund so that you can live for 3 months, 6 months, a year if you lose all your income. Right, that's the kind of the first thing before you start investing in risky stocks or bonds or anything else. So, in the same sense, I think that biostasis should be the top priority as a life extension strategy because it's something you can do right now. You can fund it, you can make the contracts right now. You don't have to wait for new research because once you get cryopreserved, you can wait for as long as it takes. So it's not that I want to go into biostasis; it's that I think I probably will have to. I don't think I'll have a choice if I want to continue living. My
Mm.
family, I don't have a whole lot of family left, but my main family is my wife, and she also has arrangements for biostasis and has had since the 1990s, so shortly before we met. So we have, that's not a conflict between us. That's something we both want to do. And I think for both of us, apart from all the general good things about life, another reason, certainly for me to want to carry on living, is I'm intensely curious to see how the story of the human race works out. I read a lot of science
Mm.
fiction. There's a lot of possible futures. I want to be there to see how things work out. Kind of like Benjamin Franklin, who
Ah,
kind of famously talked about how he'd like to be preserved to see the future of America. I think we mentioned that earlier.
yeah.
On the same way, I want to see how this works out. I also, beyond just seeing how it wants to work out, I want to help produce a better world. So one of the reasons I hope to live long is to, first of all, get into space, because I think until we're in space, we have very limited opportunity to improve the world because the entire planet is controlled by governments and they're not very keen on experiments, right? Some people trying some experimental free societies, but it's pretty tough when you're surrounded by governments. So only in space, I think that we have a chance of doing that, just like people left Europe for the new world a few centuries ago to start fresh. I want to have experiments in new societies and new economies, which I'd like to contribute towards. So to me, that's kind of a very exciting and particular prospect for the future.
Yeah. And did you ever kind of imagine if you wake up from biostasis?
Do I imagine what it's going to be like?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I just wrote about that actually. One of my last chapters I wrote for my book was on revival scenarios, what it'd be like, and rehabilitation. I
Oh.
think first, yeah, I think first of all, a lot of people kind of imagine dystopic scenarios where you'll be a slave or you'll be used for your organs. If you really think about those scenarios, they don't make any sense. They're just not. They don't make any sense, socially or politically or economically. You could grow organs or take them from living people a lot more easily than doing extensive repairs on people over months and then taking the organs. It just doesn't make any sense. And we'll have plenty of robots. You won't need slaves. So those scenarios to me don't make sense. I think any world in which someone comes back from biostasis has to be a world that, first of all, has advanced technology, otherwise they won't be able to do that, has to have a certain level of wealth to be able to afford to do it, and has to have at least enough goodwill that they'd want to do it. So that implies to me that pretty much any world you're likely to come back into is at least worth living in. Now, I don't really expect a utopia, because I just don't, I don't believe in utopias, but I think if you look at the general progression of things over the centuries, generally things have got better according to the major measures of life. So unless something catastrophically goes wrong, I think that the world I return to, if it works, should be a pretty good one. Probably better than the present, certainly a world in which I want to start again, with full knowledge that it'll be difficult. I'll be, outdated in many ways. My knowledge will be outdated. My skills will be outdated. But I'm enough of an explorer that I'm willing to do that. I moved from Europe to California, which was a fairly big jump at the time. This will be a lot bigger one, but I think I can adapt. And I also do believe that we'll have people trained to help you rehabilitate. Just like today, people who've been in a coma for years, when they wake up, they're going to need some help getting started. And I think there will be people trained to do that. I think everybody will have an AI companion where you can ask questions and figure out how things work. So I also think there's quite likely to be a community of people who survive from a certain time period, so they can stay together.
Imagine like you wake up from biostasis. What's the one thing you'd most hope humanity figured out by then?
I mean, the core thing really is the aging problem. I have to figure out the aging problem. But I would imagine that it's unlikely that I'll be revived unless that's been figured out, because there won't be much point if I'm just going to die again fairly soon after. It would only make sense in the case of people who died of, like, say, cancer in their 20s or 30s, and if you brought them back, they'd still have quite a few decades ahead of them. So that would be the most important thing, but I think that's kind of going to happen anyway if we're revived. So beyond that, I don't know. I mean, there are so many things. I would just hope for improved wisdom in the world, which seems to be a big ask. We have more and more knowledge and data, but we don't seem to get much wiser. In fact, I'm currently reading some thoughts about Stoicism from 2,000 years ago, which are pretty wise. There's nothing really any wiser since then. So that would be a big thing if we could be wiser. And how would that happen? Well, that's a tough one. I think better institutions, that's an important thing, because our minds are obviously shaped by our environment, but also possible physical changes to the brain, which I think we discussed earlier, ways of improving emotional intelligence and so on. So I would hope to see people who actually are better developed. And I think living longer, if you're living for centuries or longer, then you're going to probably work off some of the rough edges of your personality. I really hope also to see the ability to re-engineer your personality. So some of us struggle with depression or anxiety or other problems, which are just awful. Nobody should have to live with those. So I would very much hope that we'd have full control over those, be able to resolve those problems, not just by taking drugs, which is not a great solution because of side effects, but by actually making changes to the brain's structure and chemistry directly, so that it kind of produces the right kinds of neurotransmitters at the right level without side effects. So I would hope to see basically the alleviation of a lot of suffering when I return.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And yeah, what do you think it's the meaning of life?
Well, of course, the correct answer is 42, according to Douglas Adams. If you've seen The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's his supercomputer to coming up with the answer, but then people have to ask what is actually the question. So there's a problem. What is the question really? We can say the question is what is the meaning of life, but what does that mean itself? It's kind of a very vague question. In some sense, I don't think there is any meaning to life, in the sense that it's not, that there's no meaning given to it by a higher power. We're not here for any particular purpose. We're here kind of accidentally due to evolution. So I don't think there's a given meaning. Meaning is something that relates to purpose and values and goals, and that's something we each choose for ourselves. So I don't think there really is an answer to that question. It's really something we have to create for ourselves. But we do have to do that. Just pursuing our petty goals day by day does not really give your life meaning. I think you have to have some kind of long-term goals and values that give your life structure, and then it will have meaning. And then working with other people to bring those goals about will give meaning to your life.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, my final question is, what's the most important thing you've learned in your life?
Oh gosh. Wow. Okay. Uh, that's kind of pretty hard to answer off the cuff. The most important thing I've learned in my life. Uh, I don't think I can come up with the most important. I, I guess I guess if I had to pick one right now, I would say um, question yourself. Don't assume that you're right. Obviously, most of us are wrong about most things most of the time. We just kind of have to be. So don't identify with your beliefs. Don't make your self-worth depend on being right. Because what you really should be concerned about is learning and getting better, closer to the truth. So I think that we'd solve a lot of problems in our society and our personal lives if we didn't tie our self-esteem to being right, but instead to learning and becoming better. And that's very difficult. I think even people who explicitly try to do that find it quite difficult. But that's probably the most important thing because it's a key to pretty much everything else, to be able to think objectively and think straight and to learn and to improve ourselves and the world.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, Max, thank you. Thanks so much for joining me. It was amazing. Appreciate your time and energy. And yeah, see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on, Salvador.
Thank you.